Hey guys, Mr. Klein here, and we are looking at our second lesson today on the Roman Republican government. And our last lesson talked about the foundations of Rome, and the next lesson in the chapter will talk about the bulk of the Roman Republican history. So let's go ahead and let's get going. Now, at the end of the previous lesson, we were talking about two groups of people in Rome. There were the patricians, who were the ruling landowning class, and then the rest were the free citizens, or the plebeians, or plebeians as you might hear sometimes. The plebeians around 500 BC were pretty unhappy that they didn't have any say in their government. The patricians ruled. They had a two-branch government, and two of the branches we'll look at in a minute. And these two branches were designed for Rome not to have a king, but they were also designed that the plebeians could have no say in government at all. In fact, they threatened to revolt, and they decided to revolt in a very unique way. Right here is a painting of the first plebeian secession, and so this is what happened. The plebeians mounted a strike. Now, whenever we think of a strike, we usually think of people standing outside of a business holding signs, asking for raises or some other industrial action. But the plebeians were fighting for political power, and their strike was a little bit different. In fact, a little more drastic than your average labor strike. And what they did, instead of just walking around holding protest signs, is they actually shut down all of their businesses in Rome. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's interesting, that happens and stuff. Well, no, they kind of went a little bit further than that. They didn't just close down their businesses and stuff. They actually packed up their belongings and actually moved outside of the city walls and set up a tent city outside the city of Rome. And so all that was left in Rome were essentially the slaves and their patrician owners. The rest of the city was empty. So as a result, the patricians didn't have anything. They couldn't buy or anything like that, because the people who ran the city, who gave the city its life, were all gone. And as a result, the patricians came out and negotiated with them, and the city leaders made a compromise, which set up the new form of government. Now, as I just said, the government had two branches, and it added a third branch. And this compromise created what we call a tripartite government, or a government with three branches. And in keeping with the Roman tradition of not wanting a king, each part was made that no one group could get too much power. And we call this a separation of powers. So the Romans were obsessed with not having a king. Like, the Roman Republican government was designed not to have a king. And the United States, our government is based in the same idea and the same concept. And in my class, for those of you just watching this on YouTube, we're going to do primary source activities. We're going to look at what the Romans talked about, separation of the branches of government, and we'll look at American founding fathers as we formed the Constitution, and how we built our government kind of based on the Roman model. Now, let's talk about these three branches. So let's get going with this. Now, the first branch consisted generally of elected officials whose job was to run the government and also lead the army. These guys were generally called magistrates, and they had all sorts of levels of control and things like that, and each level above them could overrule the other one. Now, at the top of these magistrates was two officials. They were what we call the consuls. The consuls were two men elected to one-year terms whose job was to head the Roman government. They were kind of the president, if you will, of the Roman government. And so in your notes, I have this graphic organizer. So let's go ahead and let's look at this. The powers of the consuls. Now, the consuls were two leaders elected every year. So every year there was an election, two guys were chosen, and those two guys were kind of like co-presidents, and they ran the city of Rome. These guys had to agree on everything. Both of them had to agree in order for the consul to make a decision. So one could overrule the other one. Their general job was to lead the army. They could create some laws executively. So in other words, the consuls sometimes could get together, the two of them. They say, you know what, we need A, B, C, X, Y, and Z. And they would make a decision, and that could be followed. They would also serve as high priest for Roman religious ceremonies, as well as running some day-to-day things. And if you remember from the last lesson, we talked about the Roman Republic, that if Rome was ever in a time of war, one of them would be chosen to be a dictator during the war. And if you remember during the Roman Republic, the dictator was the guy who would lead Rome for about only lead Rome with executive, absolute powers for only 6 months at a time. And of course, Cincinnatus was the guy who was a farmer and he became dictator twice. And as soon as the war was over, he went back to farming. So that's the consuls. They're kind of like the executive branch of our government in the United States. The second branch was kind of the quote unquote most important branch of the government. And we'll talk about this, it being so important later on in the next chapter with the Roman Empire. And consuls received advice on what to do from the second branch, which was the Senate. The Roman Senate was a council of wealthy, powerful patricians who held their positions for life. Okay? In order to be a Roman citizen, in order to be a senator, you had to be a citizen. You had to have certain amounts of money. You had to earn certain amounts of land. You had to be from certain families and things like that. Okay, so let's look at for the graphic organizer's sake, the idea of the Senate right here. The Senate were a group of patrician leaders. They served for life. Their job was they created most of the laws for the Roman people. They made the decisions, they debated on it, and they would pass the laws and stuff. They advised the councils on matters, so the councils would be like, well, do we need, a new forum for us to watch gladiators fight? Well, we want to do that. Well, the Senate would debate on it and they would give their opinion about it. And they controlled the budget. This was the most important thing. Taxes that were collected for Rome could only be spent with the Senate's approval. So if the assemblies, the third branch, they wanted something, or the consuls wanted something, they would have to agree with the Senate. The Senate would have to be able to supply the funding for this. So the Senate kind of held the power of the money, so as a result, they could limit the other two branches with that. Okay, and like I said, the senators themselves, actually, interestingly enough, were appointed by the consuls themselves. So the two consuls, whenever there would be an election for the Senate or senators could be appointed, the two consuls were the people who chose them. And like I said, they had terms that were for life. So they didn't have to worry about running for a re-election or anything like that. Now, the third branch was made up of several groups of assemblies, and the textbook that we generally use for this course makes it a bit more confusing, so I went back to some primary sources and read them, and I want to clarify it for this. The assemblies had jobs were to pass laws. A majority of laws for the plebeians were passed by the assemblies. They also served as judges and elect government officials, including the consuls. So the assembly's jobs were to do that. And there were up to 3 to 10 assemblies. And two of them, the assemblies of the centuries and the other assembly, whose name is escaping me at the moment, they were kind of chosen over all of Rome, like how in the United States each Senate gets 2 senators for each state. And so these two assemblies, each district, if you will, of the Roman Republic, as Rome grew, had a vote that would go into this. They had 100 originally, and they grew up to about 197, if I'm not mistaken. So there were 3 major assemblies. They approved or rejected laws. In fact, the assemblies, the Senate and the Senate could make a law, and the assemblies could say, no, we don't want that. And importantly enough, they could decide when Rome went to war. So the consuls might want to fight to gain more land, but they could only send out the army with the approval of the assemblies, because one of the assemblies was actually a representation of the army. And going back to the plebeian secession and the plebeian revolt against the patricians, the assemblies were the only group where the plebeians could rule. And in fact, there was a special plebeian assembly who created laws that could only apply to the plebeians, and the patricians could do nothing about it. So all the branches of the Roman government could only be held by, with the exception of that small one, by patricians. And after the revolt, like I said, around 500 BC, one of the assemblies was made up of plebeians who could make up for laws for plebeians only, or even block, through veto, some of the actions by the Senate. Okay? And so overall, these three branches held even levels of power through a system called checks and balances. Okay, and so these were the checks and balances of the Roman government. So let me swap over to this slide. Let's look at the checks and balances. So in order, the consuls, the two leaders, the consuls could do the following to keep the Senate and the assemblies from becoming too powerful. The consuls chose the members of the Senate. So in other words, the Senate couldn't be filled with people who didn't want consuls. The consuls would choose them to support them. And also, sometimes the consuls could make laws without the assemblies being able to veto them. So if the consul wanted one thing and the assemblies didn't want it, well, too bad. The consuls could make that decision. The Senate had checks and balances on the other two by doing the following. For, like I said, they controlled the money. They held all the taxes. If the consuls or the assemblies wanted to do something, the Senate could just say, no, you can't, you won't get the money for it, and they could do nothing about it. Also, in terms of making laws, they could ignore the assemblies by simply ignoring their requests for laws. The assemblies couldn't propose laws for the Senate to follow. They could just kind of ask the senators, if you wanted, could you please vote on this? And the Senate didn't have to listen to them. But on the other hand, all the Roman assemblies had checks over the Senate and the consuls. For example, the assemblies actually chose the two men to rule Rome as consuls, and they could also veto laws created by the Senate, and the Senate couldn't do anything about them. So these checks and balances kind of kept the three branches equal. Now, action could be stalled if not all branches worked together. So if all three weren't in agreement, nothing could get done, and you could have government gridlock. However, when all three branches work together, Romans tend to work very quickly and efficiently. This government would work really efficiently because if the assemblies wanted a law and the Senate agreed with it, they would just talk and they would get it passed real quick. The consuls wanted to do something, they can make an executive law and get it done, and the Senate could pay for it and all this stuff. So in some ways, the Roman government was made to where there would be gridlock, but the purpose of that was to make the three branches, the consuls, the Senate, and the assemblies, all work together. And the idea was if all three branches worked together, they were all working together for the good of Rome. And it tended to work pretty well for 500 years. Now, around the time of the plebeian revolt and stuff in early Rome, the only people who actually knew the laws were the patricians. So they would pass them in the Senate and the consuls, which were the two branches of the Roman government before the revolt, and the plebeians didn't know them. So if a plebeian was breaking a law, they could be arrested, tried, and punished, and they could have no clue what the law was passed. And plebeians revolted as a result, because they were tired of being punished for laws you did not know. They would be like, for example, you're sitting in your class, and next thing you know, your teacher tells you have detention. You have no clue why. And they're like, well, you broke a rule. Well, what rule? Well, I can't tell you because only teachers are supposed to know that. That's not really fair. You wouldn't rather be punished, but if you were being punished for breaking a rule, at least you would know what rule it was. So as a result, Rome's first legal code was written on 12 bronze tablets and displayed in the Forum, which was Rome's central meeting place. It was kind of like the city center or the agora for Rome. And more laws were written afterward. And here's a recreation of 12 bronze tablets in Rome written in Italian. These were put up and everyone can see, and the idea was everyone could see them, and therefore everyone could know what the laws were. Now, even though there were lots more laws written and there were law books, in place for this, the 12 bronze tables were the basis of Roman law. These were the baseline of laws in which all other Roman laws were established, and these were written around 500 BC, around this time. So this is everything for the lesson. I know it's kind of long, I know it's kind of boring. Most people don't find civics very exciting, so let's sum this up real quick. Rome, as a result of a revolt of the plebeians, the patricians created a three-branch system of government. And the government was designed for the three branches to work together. You had the consuls, which were two leaders, who had to agree on everything, create some laws. The second branch was the Senate, where a group of patrician leaders selected for life by the consuls, and they controlled the tax money, and they created most of the laws. Then you had a whole bunch of major assemblies. Two of them represented the Roman Republic at large beyond the city of Rome. Uh, one specifically represented the army. Then you had one that represented the plebeians. They approved or rejected the laws by the Senate. They decided when Rome went to war, and actually one of the assemblies made rules just for the plebeians. Now, these three branches were kept in balance by a system of checks and balances, where the consuls, the Senate, and the assemblies couldn't get too much power in order to rule. The laws for the Roman government originated on 12 bronze tables because before then, the patricians made laws that the plebeians couldn't know, but they were still responsible for following. And as a result, these 12 stone tables formed the basis of Roman law. So there you go. That's the lesson on the Roman Republic's government. If you have any questions, please let me know, and thanks for watching.